Hello, good people. I hope you're all well. Welcome to lecture 1 for week 2 for HSP216. For this part of the lecture, we're going to focus on the histories of governing police in Australia. And in the second part of the lecture, we're going to talk more about this in terms of Aboriginal people. So, in this lecture, we're going to learn a little bit more about how policing was governed historically in Australia. And then the second part, we're going to learn a little bit more about the role of police in the colonisation of Australia's Aboriginal populations in particular. So, who governed police organisations historically? This is a key question, and there's not a huge amount of evidence that talks about this. Overall, we know that the state was the main form of police governance in history, but how this happened really was very different across the world depending on which jurisdiction you're in. Having said that, a lot of the world's first police officers had a lot more decision-making power. They weren't necessarily managed by a hierarchy. So in Australia at the moment, we have a state-based system, but it's managed by legislation that often comes down federally, and then the federal legislation feeds into what we have in each particular state. Some of the first police organisations around the world and in Australia were very much state-based, and they didn't have that legislation that told police officers what to do. Colonisation, however, very much impacted how police organisations developed in many international contexts, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Interpol, no surprises really, was a key governing body in history. It was originally the International Criminal Police Organisation. It emerged out of quite a significant increase in crime in the 1920s in Europe. And the most impacted area where this occurred was Austria. Austria then hosted a meeting of police representatives from 20 nations in 1923. And this led to the development of what we now know was the International Police Commission, which was kind of the predecessor to Interpol. They had a headquarters in Vienna, and that flourished all the way up to 1938. Interestingly enough, though, this fell away in World War II. In post-war, France offered the Commission a new headquarters in Paris, and then policing started to happen again at an international level. But during World War II, there really wasn't anything that was focused on international policing, simply because they were far too focused on the war. So after World War II, and with their new headquarters in Paris, the Commission restructured because they just lost all of their records, and they had 55 countries affiliated with them in 1955. So this is how policing happened on an international scale historically. But what about police oversight? Because Interpol didn't really have much of a role to play in that respect. So Walsh and Conway talk about a significant development in police oversight in history. They found that police complaints were formally investigated by police themselves as internal disciplinary matters, so inside the police organisation itself, or alternatively as civil or criminal actions in court, where a member of the public would bring an action in court, either a civil court or criminal court, against a police officer. Now that's changed a lot in contemporary times, where we now have a lot more independent mechanisms, because there was a push from police, government and pressure groups to try and have some sort of external independent way of overlooking the work that police did on a daily basis. As a result, this means we have fewer police complaints that are happening and being managed by police themselves. We have rather police complaint bodies that have oversight of those processes that are above police, or that are done by civilians that are often off to the side of police. So with this move historically, that meant that we had human rights and professional standards that were evident but were also conditional. So we had more control, but they were conditional on a whole bunch of different factors. So it'd be stupid for us to say that historically policing was completely unregulated and disregarded human rights. But there was certainly room for improvement in this respect. So there was no doubt that there were certain groups that had more rights than others. And we can see this in early Peelite London Metropolitan Police. They were romanticised as this kind of golden age of policing, I guess. But there was no recognition of diversity whatsoever. So Brogdon and Nia talk about the complexities of social class, gender and ethnicity being completely overlooked. Peel was inevitably paternalistic, partial and partisan, and this conception of policing that he created was certainly about how police would serve some groups over others. So this meant that London Metropolitan Police had procedures that existed around taking statements. For instance, in 1829 they had instructions that were passed to constables by first commissioners that foregrounded the importance of human rights, but that didn't necessarily mean that human rights were afforded to particular groups. In 1912 we also had the judges' rules, which stipulated boundaries around these things. But again, this meant that a white middle class person would be searched in a particular way. But on the flip side of that, folks who were living homeless in London were searched in different ways to what the white middle class people would be. Most importantly, police were very much thrust upon communities. While there was a focus on human rights, these rights were not necessarily something that were enforced through the police themselves. So the police weren't there necessarily to protect human rights. There was a lot of resistance from different parts of the world when police were first implemented. For instance, when Robert Peel did bring into power his first police service in London, there were riots. People were up in arms about this policing force and what they were going to do in London in 1829. So how was policing originally governed in Australia? Because the governance of policing in Australia was very much influenced by colonial laws from the UK, obviously, because that's where we were colonised from. So the structures and governance of policing were borrowed, it seems, mostly a little bit from the UK, most certainly, but mostly from this sort of Irish paramilitary model. Police were drawn from Irish convicts. In fact, by 1874, 82% of the Victoria Police that we now know were drawn from the Irish convicts. And Irish policing practices were very much marked by coercion. So even though the early Peelite policing in London was focused on human rights and was more about public order and making sure that things were going well and things like that, our policing in Australia was much more paramilitary and focused. It was about social manipulation and the extensive use of informers, so paying people off for information. It was characteristically non-negotiable. It was imposed social ordering. There was an absence of statutory local elective structures for police direction and accountability, and there was an omnipresence of a pervasive and bureaucratic police service. So people didn't have a say in whether or not they were a part of policing processes because it happened with everyone. Interestingly, the way that our policing happened in Australia originally mimicked what happened in the UK. I guess it's no surprise, but this changed fairly quickly in Australia. So in Britain, they had magistrates that exercised control over police boroughs in their particular areas. But in Australia, this ended up centralised and therefore different to the early UK and US. Blackler talks about how by the second half of the 19th century, policing arrangements in the Australian colonies were built upon a single centrally directed police force in each colony, as in contrast with the British county and borough tradition. So where it was localised, there was a multiplicity of discrete police forces that existed in that county and borough tradition, but we had a more centrally directed police force in Australian colonies. So police were seen as servants of political power in Australia and beneficiaries of political patronage. And this actually contradicts what we now know as police independence as a core value of policing. So police independence talks about how police should not be under the ultimate control of a democratically elected government. So no political body shall have the power to direct or command those in charge of the police organisations to adopt or reflect a particular policy or practice. So the way that we were organised in terms of governance of policing in history very much contradicted this idea of police independence. And the having ultimate control by the government over policing meant that there was not much discretion in what could happen. It was also a history of contradiction in terms of policing in Australia. The Australian police were drawn from the Irish convict population. Ironically, a lot of these people were sent to Australian colonies because they were charged and convicted with resistance against Irish police. So we drew our police officers in Australia from these people that were working towards resisting Irish police in other countries. So recruits were very much the least employable in community because they couldn't find other jobs. There were high rates of dismissal and resignation, and corruption was just everywhere. There was a lot of drunkenness and ill discipline as well. And that was very much a focus of internal police regulation. So, haul Officer Smith into the office, give him a smack on the back of the hand, say, please don't do that again, and off he goes. As opposed to having a citizen review body that would look at those processes and then get rid of Officer Smith because he was doing things wrong. In addition to all of this, the low pay of these police officers very much meant that officers supplemented their income in unauthorised ways. They were very much on the take a lot of the time. So this push towards centralisation was a significant issue, and it seemed to happen as a result of a whole bunch of different concerns. There was concerns about police, obviously, and being a fairly rough and tumble group of people, but there were also concerns about convicts and ex-convicts forming what they called a criminal class and needing more regulation and control. There was a lot of social dislocation emerging from the gold rushes. There was a huge amount of what we now call bushranging, which is where people were going around and stealing stuff on the backs of horses and all of that sort of stuff. Stopping horses and carts and things like that, taking their stuff and riding off with it. And of course, there was a lot of resistance of Aboriginal people to the processes of colonisation, which police very much had a substantial role in. So all of these things led to the formal centralisation of policing in Australia. There was this centralised approach meant that policing was imposed from the outside by the state rather than emerging within local communities. So it was highly contested and there was a lot of unrest about it. A major factor in the calls for centralisation emerged from the gold rushes and the political concern about destabilisation of society with bushranging and social dislocation. After the mid-19th century, legislation was passed to create a more highly centralised bureaucratic police organisation, and this was what led to these more centralised approaches to policing in colonial Australia. So these approaches were governed and commanded by a single officer, what we call the Chief Commissioner, the Commissioner and the Inspector and all of that sort of stuff. This officer reported to the Ministerial Colonial Secretary, and policing became a state responsibility, but this is very much to the exclusion of local communities. Interestingly enough, the only place where this wasn't the case was in Tasmania. From 1856 to 1898, police were organised on a municipal basis, and they only moved towards centralisation in Tasmania in 1899, whereas other states of Australia had very much a centralised policing approach. So policing in colonial Australia was quite haphazard. It was influenced by laws from other countries. It was influenced by social conditions as well. They were sort of saying, well, this localised process is not working, so we need a more centralised process now because of the gold rush and all of those other things that were happening, so that we could have more oversight and more centralised control over what police did on a daily basis. But that was also influenced by the fact that police were, in essence, a rowdy bunch, and they were doing a lot of things wrong, and that they needed more control that was coming down from a government level. So I hope that gives you more information about how policing happened in colonial Australia. It was certainly an interesting process, and a lot of these things happened in very bizarre ways, but it just gives you a brief summary of what did happen and how that stuff emerged. Anyway, folks, I'll be talking to you all again very soon. Laters!